President Ibrahim, President of the sovereign nation of Burkina Faso, son of the African soil, defender of his people. May grace and peace be multiplied to you through wisdom, courage, and truth. I received your letter not as a political communique, nor as a demand echoing through diplomatic channels. I received it as the cry of the soul, powerful, principled, and painful, from a son of the continent that has known too much loss, too much silence, and too many broken promises. I have read your words, not once, but many times, and each reading pierced deeper than the last, for in your voice I heard not merely the anger of a president, but the righteous cry of a continent, long wounded by the dual blades of neglect and exploitation. Let me begin now with defense, but with confession. Yes, the church has, at moments in history, stood beside colonizers, when it should have stood beside the crucified. Yet there were chapters, some long, some shamefully brief, where the mission of salvation became entangled in the machinery of subjugation, where the banner of the cross was hoisted beside flags of empire, and the teachings of Christ were diluted by the ambitions of kings. For these sins of omission and commission, I bow my head in repentance. No institution, however sacred, is above self-examination, and if the church is to remain a beacon, it must not only shine light outward, it must shine it within. You asked, will this papacy be different? And to that I reply, not only will it be different, it must be. For too long the African voice has been heard only in whispers. Your leaders have been praised only when they were pliable, and demonized when they dared to defy unjust systems. Your resources have been extracted while your people were left to scavenge what was theirs to begin with. But Africa is not a charity case. Africa is not a patient waiting for the West to administer spiritual or political anesthesia. Africa is the cradle of courage, the wellspring of song, the pulse of prophecy. It is not the world's burden, it is its teacher. Let me speak plainly, as you did, President Traoré, on colonial legacy. President Traoré, you spoke of chains not only of those that bound the bodies of our ancestors, but the invisible ones that still clutch at the soul of Africa. Let us speak truth, not as adversaries, but as men burdened with memory. Colonialism was not simply a political conquest, it was a spiritual betrayal. It was not just the theft of land, but the attempted erasure of identity. Entire civilizations with their poetry, their proverbs, their cosmologies, their sacred rhythms were silenced under foreign flags and foreign gods. The missionaries, some sincere, came with crosses in one hand, but behind them followed gunboats, traders, and governors with contracts of domination. Baptismal fonts were built next to whips. Scriptures were preached beside swords. The story of Christ who came to liberate was too often retold in the language of control, and though many of those missionaries gave their lives in service, and some stood up to the powers of empire, the broader truth remains. The church did not always stand with the oppressed. Too often it stood with the conqueror. I confess this not as a political calculation, but as a moral reckoning. Because if the church is to truly mirror Christ, then it must weep where Christ would weep. And surely he weeps for what was done in his name on African soil. I have seen the ruins of colonial prisons turned into schools. I have met grandmothers who remember their tribes being renamed. I have watched as young African seminarians ask, is this faith ours, or was it imported? Let me answer clearly, the gospel was never meant to conquer. It was meant to liberate. Christ was never a colonizer. He was a carpenter from Nazareth, brown-skinned, occupied, poor. And so I pledge that under this papacy we will revisit our history, not to dwell in guilt, but to root out denial, not to perform penance with words, but to open doors with justice. The church must become not a reminder of conquest, but a refuge for cultural rebirth. Let the next chapter be one written together by African hands in African languages and in full ownership of faith that was never truly foreign but always somehow destined to rise again from African soil. On economic injustice, President Traoré, when you speak of blood-stained minerals and hunger in the shadow of gold mines, you are not exaggerating. You are revealing a wound that the world has chosen to dress with silence. Africa is rich, yet too many of her children remain poor. Why so? Because the wealth beneath your soil, cobalt, gold, uranium, coltan, oil, has been turned into a curse, not a blessing. These were supposed to be gifts of providence, not instruments of plunder. But instead of building schools, they have built empires far from the shores of Africa. Let us no longer pretend that economic suffering is accidental. Let us no longer speak of underdevelopment as if it were nature's plan. It was policy, it was greed, it was engineered stagnation, orchestrated debt, and predatory agreements signed in glass towers, while farmers walked barefoot through dust. And yes, while the church itself may not have signed trade deals or drawn oil contracts, it has often been too quiet when it should have cried out, too cautious when it should have stood between the vulnerable and the vultures, too diplomatic when the gospel demanded disruption. There are African nations today where a child cannot drink clean water, but multinationals extract billions from the same land without paying fair dues. There are communities where women give birth in candlelight hospitals, while cargo ships full of precious resources sail out of port, guarded by foreign guns. That is not trade. That is tribute extracted from the really. And this, dear brothers and sisters of the world, is not just an African tragedy. It is a global scandal. It is the failure of our collective morality. It is the blasphemy of preaching justice on Sunday while investing in systems of extraction on Monday. President Traoré, you asked, will the Vatican name these sins? Yes, we will no longer speak of poverty without naming its architects. We will challenge institutions that pretend benevolence while negotiating for control behind closed doors. We will no longer sit at global summits in silence when African leaders are told to privatize their future in exchange for short-term loans. The church must not merely advocate for aid, it must fight for equity. We must speak of economic repentance, for true peace cannot exist where there is structural theft, where prosperity for the few is built on the perpetual depletion of the many, where Africa must always borrow back its own wealth with interest. This papacy will seek partnerships with African economists, theologians, and reformers. We will ask not how we can help Africa, but how we can dismantle the systems that have hurt her for centuries. And let us be clear, Africa does not need saving. Africa needs space to breathe, to rise, to govern her destiny without manipulation masked as mentorship. Let this be the era when the church uses its global influence not to advise politely, but to advocate prophetically. Because economic justice is not a matter of numbers, it is a matter of soul. When a mother in Ouagadougou or Goma or Bamako weeps because her educated son cannot find dignified work, or when she buries that son because he drowned trying to flee to a distant shore, we must ask, what gospel are we preaching if it does not confront the system that made that death inevitable? We must ask ourselves, what is the value of prayer if it does not drive us toward justice? And so I say to you, President Traoré, and to all of Africa, the church cannot be neutral in the face of economic oppression. Christ overturned the tables once. Now we must ask whose tables must be turned today. On political interference and sovereignty, President Traoré, when you speak of sovereignty, your voice carries the weight of centuries, during which the African will has been contested, corralled, and conditioned by powers that did not emerge from the soil of Africa, but planted themselves there like towering foreign trees, casting long shadows across native lands. The struggle for African self-determination is not a new cry. It is the old song of resistance that began when the first maps were drawn without your consent, when borders were carved by the hands of colonial ambition, and when leaders chosen not by your people but by distant interests were placed like marionettes in high office. And yet, even as flags changed and independence was declared, interference did not end. It merely changed form. Today it comes in the language of strategic partnerships, in the packaging of humanitarian aid, in the presence of military bases that were never democratically invited. We call them allies, and some may well be. But we must also ask, why does Africa remain a battlefield for the interests of others? Why must your internal affairs be negotiated in foreign capitals before they're respected at home? Why are African elections monitored with suspicion while fraudulent dealings elsewhere are called irregularities? Why is it, President Traoré, that when an African leader speaks of nationalizing resources, he is accused of authoritarianism, but when a foreign CEO exploits those same resources, he is praised as an innovator? We have built a global order where some nations act with impunity while others must beg for legitimacy. That is not peace. That is power imbalance masquerading as diplomacy, as a church rooted in the message of Christ, who was born under occupation and crucified by an empire. We cannot ignore this. Christ stood with the occupied, not the occupiers. He wept for Jerusalem, not because it was wealthy,